Snow was falling hard over Chicago the night Delaney Whitfield found the old woman behind the restaurant, and nothing about her would make sense until it was far too late. Delaney was 27, with tired hazel eyes that still managed to look kind after a 14-hour shift, chapped hands from carrying hot plates, and the worn shoes of a woman who'd walked a long way on very little. She waited tables at an upscale Italian place in River North, went home to a crumbling studio on the South Side, and carried a mountain of hospital debt her mother had left behind. So when she stepped into the freezing back alley to dump the trash and heard a faint broken sound near the dumpster, she didn't think twice. There, shivering in the snow, sat a frail old woman, maybe 68, lips blue, fingers digging through a garbage bag for something to eat. Delaney didn't call for an ambulance. She knelt down, wrapped the woman in her own coat, and led her inside to warm her up. But here's what Delaney didn't notice in the dark beneath that filthy coat was cashmere. On those trembling fingers sat a diamond ring worth more than Delaney would earn in 10 years, and the old woman kept whispering one name, over and over, like a prayer. Damon? Delaney thought she was just confused. She had no idea she'd just fed the mother of the most dangerous man in the city. If this story already has you hooked, do me a favor and hit that like button. Share it with someone who believes kindness still matters. And subscribe so you never miss what happens next. It would mean the world. Now, let's get back to that snowy alley, where one small act of mercy is about to change everything. Snow was still falling thickly outside the window pane, blurred with steam, when Delaney helped the old woman into the kitchen, now emptied into silence, the kind of silence that only comes after the last cook has clocked out and the dishwasher has finally gone still. She eased her down onto the stool beside the warming counter, where the last breath of heat from the oven was still fighting against the cold. The old woman's hands wouldn't stop trembling, and Delaney pretended not to see the way those fingers clung to the edge of the steel counter, as if the floor might tilt beneath her at any moment. She told her very softly to just sit there while she went to get her something warm for her stomach. There was soup here, real soup, not the canned kind. Then, without waiting for an answer, she ladled a bowl of minestrone and put it into the microwave, because the stoves had been turned off long ago, and watched the numbers count down with a strange impatience. When she set the bowl in front of the woman only stared at it as though she had forgotten what a spoon was for. Delaney pressed the spoon into her hand, folded those shaking fingers around the handle, and told her to eat slowly. No one was going to take it away from her. The old woman began to eat, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until Delaney had to gently touch her wrist to remind her to breathe between spoonfuls. Tears gathered in the corners of the old woman's eyes, though Delaney couldn't know whether it was because of the warmth, or the shame, or something deeper than either of those things. The woman whispered her thanks in a voice that had been softened by decades of wear, saying that Delaney was a good child. A good child. Delaney only said it was just soup, but the old woman shook her head with sudden certainty and said no, it wasn't. For a few minutes, she seemed fully awake, almost ordinary, like a grandmother who had wandered too far from a Sunday supper. But then her gaze drifted toward the swinging kitchen door, and something on her face changed. First confusion, then fear. She asked whether her son had come yet. He was always worrying. He always worried about her. She told him she was fine, but he never listened. Even when he was little, he never listened. Then she smiled at some memory only she could see, and said he had been such a solemn child, always frowning, and she used to threaten him that if he kept frowning, his face would freeze that way. Delaney asked softly what her son's name was, lowering herself to the old woman's eye level in exactly the way she had once done with her own mother during the worst days of chemotherapy, when the morphine made her drift between this world and another one. The old woman opened her mouth, then closed it again. The name had slipped away somewhere she couldn't reach. Her lower lip trembled as she said, I can't, why can't I? Delaney quickly took her hand and reassured her that it was all right. That didn't matter right now. What mattered was that she was warm and had a little something in her stomach. They would figure out the rest afterward. The old woman softened, though her eyes were still wet, and she kept holding Delaney's hand like a child, afraid of being left alone at a bus station. Just then, Delaney's phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out with her free hand, and the screen lit up with a string of numbers she had learned to fear. The final notice from the billing department at Mercy General Hospital that her account was overdue, requesting immediate contact to avoid being sent to collections. $11,000. Still there, untouched, After 2 years of double shifts, after selling her mother's wedding ring, after eating staff leftovers so she wouldn't have to buy groceries, that number had never agreed to grow smaller. It just sat there, patient and cruel, a monument to all those months she had stood watching her mother wear away in a hospital bed. She locked the phone and slipped it back into her pocket. Not now. In front of her was a stranger who needed her far more than that number did. Delaney gently said she thought they should get the old woman to a doctor for a little while, just to be safe. She could call a cab. There was a hospital not too far away. The people there were kind, she promised. They would warm her properly and find her family. But the old woman's hand tightened, and she said no hospital with a clarity so sudden it startled her. No, he will come. He always comes. Delaney softened her voice and said yes, no hospital. Then brushed a strand of silver hair back from the woman's forehead. But outside, the world was freezing, and she couldn't stay forever in an alley. At least let Delaney call someone to take her somewhere warm. Did she have a phone number? Was there anyone Delaney could call for her? The old woman only looked at her with eyes wide and lost, then said again, almost to herself, he will come. And Delaney couldn't know it yet, but the old woman was right. The first sound wasn't a knock at the door, but the sound of tires grinding over the slushy snow outside in the alley. 3 black sport utility vehicles slid up to the mouth of the alley almost at the same time, their headlights sweeping blinding white bands of light across the steam-blurred glass of the kitchen window. Delaney hadn't even had time to understand what was happening when the back door of the restaurant flew open, and the cold wind rushed in, carrying with it 4 or 5 figures dressed in dark clothes, moving fast and clean in a way ordinary people never moved. The black muzzle of a gun was pointed straight at her before she could rise from the stool. A man's voice barked at her to get away from the old woman. Put her hands up. Don't move. Delaney heard her own heart pounding in her ears as she slowly raised both trembling hands to shoulder height, her mouth dry as she stammered that she hadn't done anything. She had only given the woman something to eat. The woman had been sitting outside in the alley. She had been hungry. Please. One of them circled behind her. Another checked the old woman. The man with the gun demanded to know how long she had been keeping her there, how much she wanted, who had hired her. The questions came at her like slaps, one after another, until Delaney's mind spun, because in her terror she realized they thought she had kidnapped the woman. They thought this exhausted, trembling old woman was a hostage, not someone who had been rescued. Tears rose in her eyes, but she still forced her voice to hold steady. As she said, she swore she didn't know who the woman was. She had found her behind the trash bins. She had been freezing. Delaney couldn't just leave her out there. Just as fear tightened around her throat, the old woman suddenly snapped awake from her daze. She stood so quickly, the stool toppled over onto the floor, and in a voice that was suddenly sharp, commanding, and no longer lost at all, she shouted for them to lower their weapons immediately. She stepped between the gun muzzle and Delaney, her frail shoulders lifting like a shield. She said this girl had saved her. She had fed her. She had put a coat around her. How dared they point a gun at her benefactor? The change in the air was instant. The men froze, their eyes flicking toward one another in confusion. The gun muzzles dipped a few inches. Then, from behind them, an older man stepped inside with the unhurried gait of someone who had never needed to rush in his life. His gray-streaked hair was neatly combed, his expensive wool coat dusted with a thin layer of snow. His name was Frank, and with one slight flick of his hand, he made every remaining gun disappear into a coat, as if none of them had ever existed. He bent beside the old woman with a strangely gentle reverence, called her Mrs. Bianchi, and asked whether she was hurt, whether she was cold. The old woman held on to his arm, but she still didn't take her eyes off Delaney, still kept repeating that the girl was good, that they mustn't hurt her. Frank turned to look at Delaney with a calm, cold gaze, the gaze of a man used to weighing people in a matter of seconds. He asked her name. Delaney answered, her voice still shaking. He asked whether she had called anyone, whether she had taken photographs, whether she had told anyone about the old woman, and when she shook her head firmly and said no, she had only been about to call a cab to take her to the hospital. Something in his face softened almost beyond notice. He nodded slowly, then said in a voice that was both polite and impossible to refuse that Miss Whitfield had just done something she couldn't yet fully understand, and because of that, she would have to come with them. Not to be punished, but so that everything could be handled properly. Delaney opened her mouth to protest that she still had a shift, that she still had to close the restaurant. But then her eyes met the old woman's face, looking at her with hope and fear, and the woman's wrinkled hand reached toward her, trembling. Delaney understood that if she walked away, this woman would be left again among strangers. So she swallowed down her fear and nodded. Frank gestured to one of his men, ordered him to settle the restaurant's closure, and handle her sudden absence with the manager so no alarms would be raised. Frank wrapped the old woman in a thick fur coat someone had brought, then gently helped her toward the door. 2 men walked on either side of Delaney, not roughly, but leaving no opening for her to change her mind. And when she stepped out into the snow-covered alley where everything had begun, the 3 black vehicles were waiting, their engines rumbling as they breathed white smoke into the frozen night. The car door opened in front of her like a dark mouth leading into a world she had never known existed, and Delaney climbed inside, with no idea that she would never again be the girl who had walked out of that kitchen. The drive lasted almost an hour north along the lakeshore. The lights of the city grew thinner and thinner, then gave way to the vast darkness of the Lake Forest suburbs, where mansions sat hidden deep behind rows of trees and iron gates taller than a person. Delaney sat tucked into one corner of the cold leather seat, while the old woman dozed against her shoulder the whole way. When the convoy finally rolled through an automatic gate that opened in silence and followed a long, endless gravel drive, Delaney saw it appear through the falling snow, a massive gray stone mansion, with windows glowing in a cold yellow light, beautiful and soulless, like a museum where no one dared touch anything. She was led through a grand marble hall where the sound of her shoes echoed with lonely awkwardness, past dark oil paintings and expensive flower arrangements without a single wilted petal, into a large study lined with dark wood walls and a burning fireplace that somehow gave off no warmth that could reach her. The old woman was helped upstairs to rest, and for the first time since the alley, Delaney was separated from the only person in this place who had looked at her with anything like kindness. Then she was left standing alone on the expensive rug in the middle of the room, her hands clasped tightly together to hide their trembling, and she waited. She waited a long time inside that carefully measured silence, until a door at the back opened and a man stepped in. He wasn't huge in the way of a bodyguard, but there was a force about him that seemed to make the whole room shrink around him. His dark suit was perfectly tailored. His angular face was cold as if carved from stone, and when his dark gray eyes looked at her, there was no curiosity in them at all, only the chilled appraisal of a man deciding whether an object was an asset or a risk. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. He simply sat down behind the large wooden desk, laced his fingers together, and asked in a low, even voice that chilled her bones who she was and what she wanted from his mother. Delaney swallowed hard and replied that her name was Delaney Whitfield, that she worked as a server at the restaurant, and that she didn't want anything. He tilted his head slightly, as if that answer were ridiculous, then said that everyone who stepped into his life wanted something. The only question was whether they were clever enough to hide it. He asked how long she had been following his mother, who had paid her, whether she planned to extort him or sell information to someone else. Each question was released slowly, sharp as a knife, and Delaney felt fear rise all the way into her throat. But strangely, it was the unfairness of those accusations that lit something inside her harder than fear. She lifted her head, looked straight into those cold gray eyes, and said she had found an old woman digging through the trash for food on a snowy night, her lips blue, her body shaking so badly she could barely stand. And Delaney had done what any decent human being would have done. She had fed her. She hadn't known whose mother the woman was, and honestly, right now she didn't care. All she knew was that if she had walked past tonight without stopping, then tomorrow morning someone might have found that woman frozen to death behind that trash bin. The room went silent after that. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, and for the first time, something flickered behind the man's cold eyes. It wasn't tenderness, but the surprise of someone so used to being feared that he had forgotten what it felt like to be spoken to plainly, straight to his face. He rose, came around the desk, and walked toward her step by step until he was less than an arm's length away, close enough for her to smell sandalwood and something more dangerous beneath it. He looked down at her and said very quietly that she should know one thing. In his world, kindness was never free, and the people who claimed to be decent were usually the most skillful liars. He would find out who she really was, and if she was hiding even the smallest thing, there wouldn't be an alley anywhere in this world dark enough for her to hide from him. Delaney trembled, but she still didn't look away. She answered that he could go ahead and look. He wouldn't find anything except a girl with hospital debt who worked too many hours. The man looked at her for a long while with an unreadable gaze, then turned away and called for Frank. And Delaney stood there in the middle of that cold, luxurious room, understanding that she had just faced the most dangerous man she had ever met in her life, and that this night was still far from over. They left her in a smaller sitting room with a cup of hot tea she never touched, and out in the hallway, Frank set a thin folder on the table in front of Damon, and said in the flat voice of a man who had been doing this work far too long that they had checked everything. The girl was clean, completely clean. Delaney Whitfield, 27 years old. Her mother had died 2 years ago of cancer, leaving behind a staggering mountain of hospital debt she still couldn't escape. Her father had left when she was little. No criminal record, no connection to anyone suspicious. She had worked as a server at Tavolanera for 3 years, had once started a nursing program but dropped out when she ran out of tuition money, lived alone in a studio apartment on the south side, and took the bus to work. Frank paused, then added that there was no sign of a trap. No one behind her. The girl had simply stopped to help someone. In the silence that followed, Damon stared at the employee identification photo clipped inside the file, at the tired face and the eyes that still held something his whole life of suspicion had nearly made him forget the name for. Then he stood and returned to the room where Delaney was sitting. This time, he didn't interrogate her. He took a checkbook from inside his coat, placed it on the table, and began to write. The pen moved quickly, decisively. Then he tore out the check and pushed it toward her. He said this was compensation for the inconvenience tonight, and also payment for her silence. The number written on the check was enough to wipe away her hospital debt many times over. Enough for her to pay everything she owed, return to nursing school, and start over anywhere she wanted. He told her to take it, go home, forget everything she had seen tonight, and act as though she had never met anyone in this house. He said all of it, with the absolute certainty of a man who had never seen anyone refuse his money. But Delaney only looked at the check, then looked up at him, and pushed it back across the table. She said she hadn't fed the old woman to be paid for it. If she took this money, then the one decent thing she had done in the whole miserable week would become just another thing to be bought and sold, and she would rather carry that crushing financial burden than turn kindness into an invoice. Silence tightened around the room. Damon looked at her as if she had just spoken a language he had never heard. For one brief moment, there was real confusion on his stone-cold face, because she had just broken the only rule by which his entire world operated, that everyone had a price. Just then, hurried footsteps sounded on the stairs, and Mrs. Rosa appeared in the doorway in her nightrobe. A housekeeper tried to hold her back, but she brushed the woman's hand away. She walked straight to Delaney, took her hand, and turned to her son, saying in a voice that trembled but refused to yield that he mustn't send the girl away. This girl had been good to her. This girl had looked at her as a person, not as a burden. How long had it been since anyone had looked at her that way, Damon? She said she wanted the girl to stay. Damon stood there, caught between the mother he would burn an entire city to protect, and the girl who had just refused his money. Delaney could see the exact moment he calculated, weighed, and rearranged every piece on the board inside his head. Then at last, he said in a voice that had gone cold again, only this time with one more binding thread wrapped through it, that fine, his mother needed a caregiver, someone she trusted, and apparently his mother trusted only her. She had studied nursing, so she would stay here and care for Rosa at a salary she couldn't refuse. He said it wasn't an offer. Delaney started to object that she still had a job, that she still had a life of her own, but then she looked at the wrinkled hand clutching hers, looked into the old woman's pleading eyes, and thought of the cold, empty studio waiting for her on the south side, along with the ghost of her mother's unpaid medical bills that never ceased to haunt her. And she understood that no matter what he called it, she no longer had a way back. So she drew in a deep breath and nodded. Not for the money, not out of fear, but because of the woman holding her hand. And Damon watched that nod with an expression no one could read, as if he had just won a game of chess but wasn't sure he had truly wanted to win it. The first days in the mansion passed for Delaney like a strange dream she couldn't wake from. They arranged for her to have a room 3 times larger than her studio apartment, with sheets so soft that she felt out of place just lying on them. During the day, she spent every hour with Rosa, helping her eat, bathe, and take her medicine on time, walking with her along the long corridors, and reading aloud from the old books Rosa had loved since she was young. And it was in those slow hours that Delaney began to see the pieces of a story no one in this house dared speak aloud. In her clearer moments, Rosa told her in a soft voice that Damon hadn't been this kind of child when he was little. He had once been a gentle boy who liked to draw and was afraid of thunder. He had once wanted to become an architect so he could build beautiful homes for people to live in. But his father, the man whose name Rosa still spoke with a tremor even now, had not allowed that. He had said his son was not allowed to be weak. Through tears, she told Delaney that when Damon was 12 years old, his father had forced him to witness things no child should ever see, had beaten him whenever he cried, had taught him that compassion was a crack. Enemies would slip through, that trusting someone was the fastest way to be betrayed. Little by little, they had hollowed out that gentle boy and packed something hard and cold inside him instead. Rosa held Delaney's hand and said she had stood there watching it happen, and she hadn't saved her own son. That was the greatest regret of her life. Delaney sat there in stunned silence, and for the first time, she saw that behind the cold stone wall of the man who had pressed her with those cruel questions was a boy who had once been afraid of thunder. She caught sight of Damon many times in those days, usually when he thought no one was paying attention, standing silently outside his mother's door and looking in with an expression. He erased the moment he realized Delaney was watching him. One evening, after Rosa had fallen asleep, Delaney found him in the study, and this time she couldn't hold herself back. She said plainly that she couldn't understand how a man could love his mother that much and still live the way he was living, still do the things she knew he was doing. Damon looked up at her, with more weariness than anger, and said she knew nothing about his life, that there were worlds where kindness couldn't survive a single night. Delaney answered that was just the excuse men like him told themselves so they could sleep better, that everyone had a choice no matter how hard that choice might be. He let out a quiet laugh with no amusement in it at all, and asked whether she knew what choice looked like when she was 12 years old, and the person teaching her about choice was someone willing to break her arm if she chose wrong. That question hung between them and left Delaney choking on silence, but she still didn't step back. She said softly that she was sorry for the boy he had been. She truly was, but that boy was now a grown man, and every day he was still choosing that same road all over again. His mother had never wanted him to become this. She told Delaney that every day, Delaney saw those words reach someplace inside him that made him go still. His face darkened, and she thought she had gone too far, but he only turned his head and looked out the snow-covered window for a long while before saying in a low, hoarse voice that she should go to bed. It was late, and that was all. But when Delaney stepped out of the study, she realized her heart was beating fast, not from fear, but from something far more dangerous, the feeling that behind that layer of ice, there was still a person who had not completely died, and that somehow, without knowing when it had begun, she had started wanting to find him, even though she knew very well that in this world, the curiosity of a decent person could cost more than she could afford to pay. It happened late one afternoon, when Delaney went looking for Frank to ask about Rosa's medication and lost her way into the east wing of the mansion, where she had never been allowed to set foot. A door stood slightly open, and before she could understand what was happening, she saw something she would never forget. In the room, beneath the cold lights, a man was tied to a chair, his face smeared with blood, and two of the men she had seen that night in the alley were standing over him. Damon was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching with the absolute calm of a man observing an ordinary piece of business. His voice sounded flat, and even as he asked whom the man had given the information to, and how long he had been betraying him, no anger, no hesitation. It was that coldness that made Delaney shudder more than any shouting could have. She froze on the threshold, a small sob breaking from her throat before she could stop it, and Damon turned sharply and saw her. In that instant, something passed over his face that looked almost like shame, but it vanished at once, and he ordered someone to take her out, in a voice as sharp as ice. Delaney staggered away, ran down the hall to her room, her heart pounding wildly and her stomach twisting. She locked the door, sank to the floor, and trembled for a long time. The image of that blood-covered face and Damon's emotionless eyes kept returning again and again in her mind, and for the first time she truly understood whose roof she was living under. Not a lonely man who needed pity, but a man who could order another human being destroyed without blinking. She told herself that tomorrow morning she had to find a way to leave this place. She had to. But that night, all her plans dissolved because of a terrified scream from Rosa's room. Delaney rushed over and found the old woman standing in the middle of the room in a state of absolute panic, her eyes wide open and staring at things that weren't there. She tore at the blankets and pillows, called out the name of her dead husband, begged him not to hurt her son, not to hit the boy anymore. He was too young, and she didn't recognize Delaney. She shrank back in fear when Delaney came near, pushed her away, and sobbed like a lost child. Delaney knelt in front of her, not trying to hold her, only lowering her voice until it was gentle and soft. She said nothing. She began to sing, an old lullaby her mother had once sung to her on rainy nights. The slow, warm melody slipped through the old woman's panic like a golden thread in the dark. Delaney sang it over and over again, and little by little, Rosa stopped struggling. Her breathing slowed. The terror in her eyes began to soften. Then she let Delaney wrap an arm around her shoulders and guide her back to bed. Delaney kept singing quietly, stroking Rosa's silver hair until she fell asleep, her face finally smoothing into peace. And it was only when Delaney lifted her head that she saw him. Damon was standing outside the doorway, and she didn't know how long he had been there. The man whom she had seen only hours earlier watching someone being tortured without blinking was now standing in the darkness of the hall with silent tears running down his stone-carved face. He didn't wipe them away. Maybe he didn't even know he was crying. He only looked at his mother sleeping peacefully in a stranger's arms, looked at the one thing that neither money nor power nor all the fear he had spread across this city had ever been able to buy for her: peace. And when his eyes met Delaney's across the dark room, there was no wall there anymore. There was only a man stripped bare before his own pain. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but then he said nothing. He turned quietly and disappeared into the dark, leaving Delaney sitting there with her heart pounding, understanding that she had just seen the first crack in the ice, and that from this moment on, nothing between them would ever be the same again. After that night, something between them changed, though neither of them gave it a name. Damon began appearing more often during the hours Delaney spent with Rosa. He would sit quietly in the corner of the room, listening as she read to his mother, sometimes adding a story from Rosa's youth that only he would know. And Delaney realized the ice was slowly melting, revealing a man who was sharp, intelligent, and lonely to the very bone. Then one evening, he had someone bring a long velvet-wrapped box to her room. Inside was an expensive midnight blue evening gown, along with a note saying he needed her to accompany him to a gathering that night. Delaney meant to refuse, but Frank explained that it was an important meeting with partners, and Damon needed to make it appear as if everything was under control. The presence of a calm woman beside him would make him less vulnerable to scrutiny, so she reluctantly put on the dress, and when she came down the staircase, she caught Damon's eyes lingering on her longer than necessary, with a look she had never seen from him before. The party was held in a mansion even more extravagant than the one she was living in, with crystal lights glittering overhead, wine flowing like water, and elegantly dressed people speaking to one another with smiles that never reached their eyes. Delaney walked beside Damon, her hand resting lightly on his arm as she had been instructed, feeling clearly the way the whole room seemed to part when he passed through, the way people desired him and feared him at the same time, and she understood that she was seeing his empire laid bare before her, magnificent and rotten all at once. Throughout the evening, he introduced her vaguely, protected her from curious questions, and in one moment, when a drunken man made an indecent remark to her, a single look from Damon was enough to make the man go pale and step back. Delaney hated the feeling that some part of her felt safe beside someone so dangerous. Late that night, when they returned to the mansion, snow was falling again beyond the porch. The two of them stopped in the great silent hall, with the echo of the party still clinging to them. Damon said softly that he had never seen anyone walk through his world and still remain as clean as she had tonight, that beside her, he could almost remember what it felt like to be an ordinary human being. He lifted his hand to brush a loose strand of hair from her cheek, and the same fingers that had once ordered so much pain touched her with a tenderness she hadn't expected. Delaney felt herself leaning toward that touch. The space between them narrowed. His breath was warm against her lips. There was barely half an inch left between them. Her heart was beating wildly, and some part of her ached to dissolve into that moment. But just before their lips touched, the image of the man tied to the chair with his blood-covered face flashed through her mind, along with Damon's cold, even voice in the room in the east wing. And she suddenly realized that if she let herself fall into this, little by little she would learn to close her eyes. She would learn to call evil business. She would become a calm, beautiful woman standing beside a monster and smiling. She would lose the very piece of her humanity that had made her stop beside the trash bins on that snowy night. So she stepped back, her breath trembling, and said very softly that she couldn't. She was sorry, but she couldn't be the person who helped him feel as if he were still human while he continued doing those things. She couldn't care for him, and also close her eyes to what he caused. Doing that would kill her. Damon's face went briefly rigid at the rejection, hurt flashing there before the familiar wall rose again. He stepped back, gave a curt nod, said she was right, then turned and walked away, leaving Delaney standing alone in the hall as tears slid silently down her face, because she knew she had just done the right thing, but that didn't make her heart hurt any less. And for the first time, she was frightened to realize that she had already begun to care for the man she should never have loved. In a dark bar on the south side of the city, far from the crystal lights of Damon's world, a man named Tony Riggs sat in a shadowed corner, sipping hard liquor and listening as one of his underlings reported to him. Tony had been in the organization for nearly 20 years, longer than Damon had been in power. He had once believed that when Damon's father died, the seat at the top would belong to him, not to a spoiled boy he had always considered too soft. For years, he had swallowed that bitterness and waited for an opening. Now that opening had finally appeared. The underling told him about the strange girl who had suddenly appeared inside the mansion, about Damon taking her to the party, about the way he looked at her. And Tony's eyes lit up, because he understood at once that he had found the thing he had been searching for all this time. A weakness, a crack in a man everyone had believed could not be touched. Tony leaned back in his chair and began weaving his plan. He knew that trying to overthrow Damon through direct force would be suicide, because loyalty within the organization still leaned toward Damon. But if he could plant doubt, if he could make the heads of the branches believe that Damon had grown weak because of a woman, that he had allowed emotion to cloud his judgment, and was putting the entire organization in danger, then that loyalty would begin to fracture. Tony was patient and cunning. He began whispering into the ears of the people who needed to hear it that the girl was not as simple as she appeared, that a poor server suddenly showing up at the exact moment to save the boss's mother, and then slipping straight into the mansion, was too convenient to be coincidence. He had people fabricate a few vague pieces of evidence. An untraceable call, a photograph of her standing near an unfamiliar car, just enough to plant in already suspicious minds the idea that Delaney was a spy placed there by an enemy force, or worse, by the federal investigators themselves. And that Damon was either too stupid to see it, or had been manipulated by her so completely that he could no longer be trusted to lead. Tony knew very well that a slander didn't need to be true. It only needed to sound reasonable enough to make people doubt. And once the seed of doubt had been planted, it would grow on its own in the dark. He laid out each step, first isolating Damon from his closest allies by making them question his judgment, then creating a crisis that would force him to reveal his weakness, and finally, when the time was ripe, launching a swift purge to remove both Damon and the girl at once, then blaming it all on the very enemy force he had invented. One arrow would strike many targets. He would become the hero who restored order and step into the chair he believed had always belonged to him. Tony smiled in the darkness and told his underling to watch her closely, record every move she made, and especially find out what that old woman meant to Damon. Because Tony understood that in a world where every man hid his weakness, the one who found that weakness first would be the one who won. And Damon Cross now had not one weakness, but two, a confused old mother and a girl he had already begun to care for. He lifted his glass in the darkness as if offering a toast to himself, completely unaware that the fateful night when all his schemes would collide was tied to a secret from Damon's own family past, one even Tony could never have imagined. The answer came to Delaney on a quiet afternoon as she sat with Rosa by the window watching the snow. The old woman was unusually lucid that day, and suddenly she asked whether the little eatery on the street was still there, the one with the wooden tables and the smell of tomato sauce she used to cook every morning. Delaney, confused, asked which eatery she meant, and Rosa smiled distantly as she told her that many years ago, when she and her husband had first arrived in this country with empty hands and a small son, they had opened a tiny Italian eatery in the neighborhood people now called River North. Back then, it had still been poor and worn down, not glittering the way it was now. The two of them had worked from morning until late at night, Rosa in the kitchen and her husband waiting tables, while little Damon often sat at the corner table doing his homework after school. She said those had been the poorest years of her life, but also the happiest, before her husband fell into the wrong connections, before money and power and violence swallowed everything whole. The name of the place back then was Tavola Nera, and Delaney sat frozen as the truth slowly pieced itself together in her mind, because Tavola Nera was the elegant Italian restaurant where she had worked as a server for 3 years. It was the very place where she had found Rosa in the alley behind it, on that snowy night. She realized that the glamorous restaurant where the city's upper class now gathered had been built from the very poor family eatery. Rosa and her husband had run nearly 25 years before, that Damon's empire had risen from the same piece of ground where his parents had once sweated for honest, small change. And suddenly Delaney understood what had led the old woman there in her confusion. Rosa held her hand and went on in a voice that grew softer and softer, saying that on the night she slipped outside, everything in her mind had become tangled. She no longer remembered where she was or what year it was. She only remembered that it was very late, and little Damon still hadn't come home. She had to go find her son. She was certain he was still the little boy sitting at the corner table doing his homework, and her aging feet, guided by a memory deeper than reason, had carried her back to that exact place across the city in the snow to look for the little boy from long ago. She had stood in front of the restaurant she no longer recognized, panicked because she couldn't find her eatery anywhere, then wandered into the alley behind it and collapsed there from exhaustion. Delaney wrapped her arms around the old woman as tears spilled down her face, because she understood that the moment, which had seemed so accidental, had not been accidental at all. A mother, lost inside her own forgetting, had gone searching for the son this world had stolen from her, and fate had placed Delaney in that exact place on that exact night. That evening, when Damon returned, Delaney went to him and told him everything Rosa had said. She saw his face change color when he heard the name of the old eatery. He sank into a chair, as if his legs could no longer hold him, and in a broken voice Delaney had never heard from him before, he confessed that he still remembered that corner table. He still remembered the smell of his mother's tomato sauce and his father's laughter before everything fell apart. Years earlier, when he was building his empire, he had deliberately bought that very piece of land and built the restaurant over it, as a way of holding on to whatever was left of his family, something he had never dared tell anyone. And now, knowing that his mother, in her confusion, had found her way back to the exact place where everything had begun to search for the boy he no longer was, something inside his chest broke open. He lifted his eyes to Delaney, red-rimmed and raw, and said that maybe she hadn't been brought into his life by accident. And in that moment, there was no longer a crime boss and a server between them, only two wounded people standing among the ashes of things that might have been different. Tony chose the exact night he knew Damon would take most of his men away from the mansion to deal with a situation Tony himself had staged to lure them out. And when the snow began falling heavily again outside, the Lake Forest mansion was left with only a scattered handful of guards. Delaney was sitting by Rosa's bed, reading to her, when she heard glass shatter and a dry, sharp explosion echo up from downstairs, then shouting, running footsteps, and burst after burst of gunfire tearing through the silence of the house. For 1 second, she went completely still. Then instinct took over. She rushed to lock the bedroom door and pulled Rosa down behind the large bed. The old woman, panicked and unable to understand what was happening, kept trembling and calling her son's name. Delaney held her tightly and whispered that everything would be all right, even though she herself didn't believe it. The gunfire came closer and closer. Heavy footsteps advanced down the hallway. Then the bedroom door shook under a series of kicks. Delaney looked around desperately for a way out. She helped Rosa stand, meaning to guide her into the inner bathroom and barricade them there, but the door burst open. 2 of Tony's men rushed in with guns in their hands, and behind them Tony stepped in slowly, wearing a crooked smile. He looked at Rosa, then at Delaney, and said it was unfortunate, but sometimes, to clear a chessboard, a person had to remove a few pieces. He ordered his men to finish them both and make it look as if the enemy force had done it. The man nearest them raised his gun and aimed at Rosa, and in that moment, time seemed to slow for Delaney. She didn't have time to think. She didn't have time to be afraid. There was only one thing in her mind, the woman standing behind her, the mother who had put herself between Delaney and a gun on that first night in the kitchen. So Delaney did the same. She lunged forward, shoved Rosa down behind the bed, and turned her own back into a shield between the gun muzzle and the old woman at the exact moment the shot rang out. A burning impact tore through her shoulder and knocked her staggering backward. She heard Rosa scream in terror. She heard herself collapse onto the floor. Hot blood spread quickly, soaking through her clothes. The pain arrived 1 beat after the shock, then flared so violently that darkness swam across her eyes. But in the middle of that pain and chaos came the sound of the front door downstairs being smashed open, followed by a new wave of gunfire, because Damon had realized he had been tricked and had returned with his men far sooner than Tony had calculated. He charged up the stairs just in time to see Delaney crumpled in a pool of blood, while his mother cowered behind the bed, and something inside him snapped. The cold, calculating man vanished, replaced by pure rage. He shot down the man who had fired before the man could even turn around, then stormed into the room like a force of nature. Tony's men scattered in seconds, and when Tony realized the tide had turned, he rushed to escape through the rear door. Damon dropped to his knees beside Delaney, one hand pressing hard against the wound, pouring blood from her shoulder, the other trembling as he lifted her head. His voice was hoarse as he called her name, telling her to stay with him, to look at him, not to close her eyes. And through the haze of pain, Delaney still tried to move her lips and ask whether the old woman was all right, whether she was safe. Even lying in her own blood, she was still worried about someone else first. That question blurred Damon's eyes. Rosa crawled to her side, clutching Delaney's cooling hand and sobbing that the girl was her angel. Frank rushed in, shouting for an ambulance and the private medical team. Damon swept Delaney up into his arms, her blood soaking his shirt red, and as he ran, he whispered to her like a prayer that she wasn't allowed to leave him, that there were too many things he hadn't had the chance to tell her. And in that life and death moment, amid sirens, falling snow, and blood, an entire empire of power suddenly became meaningless beside the fragile life of a girl who had dared to use her own body as a shield for someone she barely knew. Only because to her, a human life would always be worth more than anything else in the world. After the private medical team carried Delaney into the vehicle with Rosa, and Frank swore he wouldn't leave her side for even half a step, Damon placed his mother and the girl into trusted hands and returned with a single purpose, burning low in his chest. His men had stopped Tony as he tried to escape through the snow-covered rear garden, and now he was being forced to his knees on the white snow before Damon. There was no arrogant, crooked smile left on his face, only a trembling traitor who knew exactly what fate was waiting for him. Damon drew his gun, his face empty of all expression in the cold garden light. He stepped forward and pressed the muzzle to Tony's forehead. Tony began stammering pleas, then shifted into threats, saying that if Damon killed him, the other branches would rise up. But Damon barely heard any of it. Inside his mind, there was only the image of Delaney collapsing into a pool of blood because of the bullet this man had ordered fired. Only his mother's pale face, and the rage urging him to pull the trigger at once. His finger was already on the trigger. This was what he had been taught all his life to do. A traitor had to die. That was the only law of his world, and no one would blame him for it. But at that exact moment, something else forced its way into his mind. Not an image of blood, but the image of Delaney kneeling in the kitchen on that snowy night, wrapping her coat around a strange old woman, the sound of her singing a lullaby to soothe his mother to sleep. The question she had whispered while lying in her own blood, asking whether the old woman was safe. The way she had once told him that everyone had a choice, no matter how difficult that choice might be. And suddenly he saw himself through her eyes. He saw that if he pulled the trigger now, he would forever be nothing more than the thing his father had shaped him into. He would prove that the little boy who had once been afraid of thunder truly was dead, and that the blood Delaney had spilled tonight had only saved another monster. His gun hand began to tremble. His breath turned to white smoke in the freezing night. Tony looked up, saw that hesitation, and grew even more frantic. But Damon no longer heard him. He stood there for a long time, caught on the thin line between the man he had always been and the man he still might become. Then, slowly, he lowered the gun. In a hoarse voice, he said that killing him would be too easy, and he was too tired of easy things. He ordered his men to tie Tony up, but not to kill him. He said Tony would be handed over with every piece of evidence of what he had done, that he would have to face the consequences in a way the underworld had never been used to. Not through a bullet in the night, but through his own public collapse. The men standing around them were stunned, because this was not how things were usually handled, but no one dared disobey. And as Tony was dragged away, still looking back at him with both shock and contempt, as if he couldn't believe Damon was letting him live, Damon stood alone in the snowy garden, looking at the gun in his hand, then at Delaney's blood still spread across his sleeve. And he understood that he had just crossed a line he could never uncross, not because he had become a good man overnight. He knew too well there was still too much darkness inside him, still too much sin that couldn't be washed clean. But for the first time in his life, he had chosen a road different from the one they had forced him onto when he was 12 years old. And he had done it because of a girl who had taught him that true strength did not lie in being able to take a life, but in daring to spare one. He clenched his blood-stained hand, lifted his head toward the night sky, pouring down snow, and for the first time in many years, he whispered something almost like a prayer. Let her live. The surgery lasted for many hours, and Damon sat through all of it in the hallway of the private hospital his men had locked down with careful security, still wearing the shirt stained with her blood, his hands clasped together and pressed against his forehead. For the first time in his life, the man who was used to giving orders over the life and death of others was completely powerless before a closed door. At last, the doctor came out and said the bullet had grazed past without striking the main artery. She had lost a great deal of blood and would need a long time to recover, but she would live. And when Damon heard those words, his entire rigid body seemed to empty of strength. He bowed his head and let out a long, trembling breath he hadn't allowed himself to take in 23 years of pain. Rosa was taken home by Frank to rest after she had been reassured, but Damon refused to leave. He stepped into the hospital room where Delaney lay asleep among the IV lines and the steady beeping of the heart monitor, her face pale but peaceful, and he pulled a chair close to the bed, sitting there and looking at her for a very long time, as if he needed to memorize the fact that she was still breathing. He didn't sleep that night. Near dawn, Delaney stirred and woke, her tired eyes slowly opening and settling on his hollowed face. She whispered, asking whether he had been sitting there all night. Damon didn't answer right away. He only reached for her hand and held it carefully, as if he were afraid she might break. Then, in a hoarse, fractured voice she had never heard from him before, he said she was the most foolish person he had ever met, who used their own body to shield someone almost a stranger from a bullet. Delaney smiled faintly, though the movement made her grimace in pain, and answered that the old woman wasn't a stranger to her. Damon lowered his head and pressed his forehead against the back of her hand for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were red. He said that all his life, people had looked at him in only two ways, either as a weapon to use or a threat to fear. No one had ever looked at him as a human being. No one had ever dared tell him to his face that he was wrong. No one had ever given his mother the peace his entire fortune couldn't buy. No one had ever been willing to die to save someone they owed nothing to, until she appeared. He said she had stepped into his rotten world and somehow kept herself clean, and that very thing had forced him to look back at everything he had become. Delaney listened in silence as tears slid down her pale cheeks. She squeezed his hand lightly and said the little boy who liked to draw and was afraid of thunder had never truly died. She had seen that boy many times, in the way he stood outside his mother's door, in the tears he shed the night she sang the lullaby, and in the fact that last night he hadn't pulled the trigger because Frank had told her he had spared Tony. Damon was silent for a long time, then confessed that he had stood on that line with his finger on the trigger, and the only thing that had pulled him back was her, the way she looked at the world. He said he didn't know whether he could become a good man. He had done too many unforgivable things, but for the first time, he wanted to try. He wanted to become a man worthy of the way she had looked at him. And in that dim hospital room at dawn, Delaney lifted her weak hand and touched his face, promising nothing about the future, not pretending the road ahead would be easy, simply staying there with him in that fragile moment between the past and something that did not yet have a name. And for the first time in a very long while, both of those wounded souls felt they were no longer alone. Damon's change didn't come like a miracle overnight. It came one step at a time through the long months that followed, and the first step was the hardest one. He contacted a lawyer he trusted, and through that lawyer began a process that, in his world, was considered the most unforgivable taboo. He reached out to the federal prosecutors and proposed a cooperation agreement. In exchange for leniency, he would turn over everything he knew about the criminal network his father had left behind and that he himself had expanded, including Tony Riggs and his rebellious men, along with enough evidence to dismantle multiple branches that had caused so much suffering in the city for years. It was a deadly dangerous decision, because it made him a target for every man who had once stood on his side. But he understood that if he truly wanted to step out of the darkness, he couldn't do it halfway. He couldn't want redemption while still keeping one foot in the mud. Frank, who had been with the family for nearly a lifetime, stood beside him in that decision. He said he had waited too long to see Mrs. Bianchi's son find his way back to the man he should have become, and it was Frank, with his connections and his caution, who helped arrange everything so it could happen as safely as possible. Alongside that legal process, Damon began the slow and complicated work of dismantling his empire. He liquidated the illegal operations, gradually shifted the enormous resources of cross-holdings into fully legitimate businesses in real estate and construction. And for the first time, he allowed the part of himself that had once dreamed of becoming an architect to rise again. He began working on affordable housing projects for poor workers in the very neighborhoods his organization had once exploited, as a clumsy and belated way of giving back what had been taken. But what moved Delaney most was that, once she had recovered enough to leave the hospital, Damon took her to see a building he had just renovated, a free support center for working families drowning in medical debt, a place that offered legal counseling, hospital bill assistance, and care for elderly people living with dementia. On the sign by the entrance, 2 names were carved side by side. One was his mother's name, Rosa Bianchi, and the other was the name of Delaney's late mother. He said he wanted those 2 women to be remembered not for what life had taken from them, but for the kindness one of them had passed down to her daughter, the kindness that had changed everything. Delaney stood before that sign with tears streaming down her face, because she understood that the $11,000 debt that had once weighed down her life, that had once made her believe she had nothing left to give, had now become a place that would help carry hundreds of other families, so they wouldn't have to endure what she and her mother had endured. Damon confessed to her that he knew very well no center and no project could erase the things he had done in the past. There were sins that would follow him for the rest of his life, and he had no illusion that he had become a good man. He was only trying, every day, to become a little better than he had been the day before, and that was all he could promise. Delaney took his hand and said that was exactly what real redemption looked like. Not becoming perfect, but daring to look straight into your own darkness and still choosing, every day, to walk toward the light. And as the 2 of them stood there before the building named for 2 mothers, in the middle of a city that had witnessed too much pain, Delaney felt for the first time that the price her kindness had paid on that snowy night had not been wasted after all. Spring came late to Chicago that year, but when it arrived, the snow melted away, and the trees lining the streets of River North began to show their first green buds. On one gently sunlit morning, there was a rare moment when Rosa was completely clear. She sat by the window, holding her son's hand and Delaney's hand, looking at them with the bright gaze of a mother who had been waiting for this for a very long time. She said that all her life, she had prayed for only one thing, to see her son find the heart people had tried to take from him when he was still a little boy. And now she knew that the boy who used to draw had truly come back. She placed Delaney's hand inside Damon's, and softly said that this girl was the gift life had sent to heal both mother and son, and he mustn't let her slip away. Though in the days that followed, her memory slowly faded again, that moment remained like a blessing. With support from the foundation named after the 2 mothers, Delaney finally returned to complete the nursing program she had once been forced to leave behind. She said she wanted to devote her life to caring for the most vulnerable people, just as she had cared for her own mother and for Rosa. And Damon continued his slow journey of washing the past from his hands and building again from the ruins, not perfectly, not easily, but more steadily with each passing day. Then, on a weekend afternoon, the 3 of them returned to Tavolanera, but this time, Delaney didn't enter through the back door in her old worn uniform to serve other people. This time, she walked in through the front door and sat down at the table in the corner, the very corner where nearly 25 years before, a boy named Damon had once sat doing his homework after school while his mother cooked in the kitchen. The afternoon sunlight poured warmly through the window onto the faces of 3 people who had all been wounded in very different ways, yet had now found one another. Rosa smiled when she smelled the familiar scent of tomato sauce. Damon told Delaney his memories of this place in a voice lighter than any he had ever had before. And Delaney, sitting between them, suddenly realized that the restaurant that had once witnessed the most miserable days of her life had now become the place that witnessed the warmest reunion, that the circle had closed completely. And what she carried in her heart through the whole journey was what her mother had once told her, that kindness is never wasted. Because on that snowy night when she knelt beside a strange old woman in the alley, she hadn't known that one small act of kindness could light up an entire human being sinking in darkness, could return to a mother the son she thought she had lost, and could change so many other fates through a home bearing the names of 2 women. The lesson that remained after everything was simple yet profound, that every person, whether ragged or wealthy, whether lost or guilty, deserves to be seen as human and treated with kindness. We never know where one small gesture of compassion may take root and bloom in the distant places of someone else's life. And human dignity doesn't lie in what people possess, but in how we choose to treat one another. If this story has touched your heart, please press like, share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so we can listen together to many more meaningful stories every day. We would love to know how you feel about this story and what it reminds you of in your own life. Have you ever given or received an unexpected kindness that changed everything? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always treasure and listen to every one of your stories. Thank you for spending your time listening until the very last moment. May everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days. Goodbye, and see you again in the next videos.